September 15th, 1916, 6:20 a.m. German Forward Observation Post, Flares Sector, Somme. Lieutenant Wilhelm Wurtig of the 163rd Infantry Regiment, Bavarian Reserve Division, pressed his field glasses against the concrete aperture of his bunker, scanning the British lines through the morning mist. A 16-year veteran who'd served in German East Africa before the war, Wurtig had survived 2 years of Western Front combat by trusting his experience. He understood trench warfare's mathematics. Machine guns defeated infantry, artillery suppressed machine guns, and breakthrough was impossible without catastrophic casualties. What he observed at 6:22 a.m. violated every principle of defensive firepower doctrine he'd learned at the Munich Military Academy. A massive shape emerged from the British lines. Not a vehicle. Vehicles couldn't cross trenches. Not artillery. Artillery didn't move toward enemy positions. The thing crushed barbed wire entanglements as if they were grass, crossed the first trench line without pausing, and continued forward with machine guns firing from sponsons on its flanks. Behind it, British infantry advanced in relative safety, using the machine for cover. Wurtig's MG-08 crews fired 2,000 rounds at the approaching metal monster. Standard 7.92mm bullets sparked harmlessly off its armor. What Wurtig didn't know, what no German officer would understand until months of desperate tactical experimentation, was that the British had solved the Western Front's fundamental problem. They had created a weapon system that rendered defensive firepower mathematics obsolete, protected infantry during the assault, and made breakthrough tactically possible. German intelligence had dismissed reports of these landships as British propaganda designed to intimidate German morale. The 163rd Infantry Regiment was about to discover that the propaganda was real, mobile, armored, and unstoppable by conventional defensive doctrine, the doctrine of defensive superiority. German defensive doctrine in 1916 rested on calculations developed at the Kriegsakademie in Berlin and refined through 2 years of Western Front experience. The mathematics were brutal and reassuring. A properly constructed defensive position with interlocking machine gun fields of fire could stop any infantry assault before attackers reached the trench line. The German Army's 1914 Field Service Regulations specified that each defensive sector should maintain 1 machine gun per 50 yards of front line. By 1916, the Somme defenses exceeded this standard, with MG-08 positions every 30 yards, concrete bunkers 30 feet deep, and barbed wire entanglements 30 yards thick. General Erich von Falkenhayn, chief of the German General Staff until August 1916, had explicitly stated in his May 1916 strategic assessment, "Defensive firepower provides absolute security against breakthrough. The enemy can gain ground only through attrition rates we can sustain longer than they can maintain assault pressure." This confidence came from documented battlefield results. During the Somme offensive's first 2 months, July 1st through August 31st, 1916, British forces had advanced an average of 1.3 miles at a cost of 198,000 casualties. German casualties during the same period, 85,000. The defensive mathematics worked. German staff officers studied recent battle reports with satisfaction. At Pozieres, in July, Australian forces required 6 weeks and 23,000 casualties to capture a village 800 yards deep. At Delville Wood in August, South African and British forces suffered 19,000 casualties for a wooded area of 156 acres. British artillery bombardments grew more intense. The preparatory bombardment for Flers-Courcelette would fire 850,000 shells, but defensive positions 30 feet underground survived even heavy shelling. Machine gun crews emerged from dugouts after bombardments ceased, established weapons in prepared positions, and inflicted predictable casualties on advancing infantry. The system was sustainable. What German doctrine couldn't account for was a weapon that protected infantry from defensive firepower. Crossed terrain obstacles that stopped conventional vehicles and functioned as mobile artillery, machine gun platform, and wire-crushing obstacle breachers simultaneously. The Kriegsakademie's tactical calculations assumed all attacking forces would be vulnerable to defensive fire during the assault. That assumption, like France's faith in offensive outrans 2 years earlier, was about to collide with British industrial innovation. The Landship project, Admiralty innovation. The weapon that would break German defensive doctrine originated not from the British War Office but from the Royal Navy. Winston Churchill, First Lord of the Admiralty until May 1915, established the Landships Committee in February 1915 after reviewing reports of trench warfare stalemate. Churchill understood naval armor principles. Thickness sufficient to defeat standard projectiles transformed vulnerability into invulnerability. He authorized £70,000 for research into armored, tracked vehicles capable of crossing trenches. The technical challenge was unprecedented. Lieutenant Walter Gordon Wilson, a Royal Navy engineer, and William Tritton, managing director of William Foster and Company agricultural machinery manufacturer in Lincoln, collaborated on the design through summer and fall 1915. They needed to create a vehicle that could cross an 8-foot trench, traverse a 4.5-foot vertical obstacle, operate on cratered battlefield terrain, carry sufficient armor to defeat German 7.92mm machine gun fire, and mount weapons for suppressing defensive positions. Wilson solved the trench crossing problem with a rhomboidal track configuration, elongated tracks that extended beyond the vehicle's hull, allowing the center of gravity to traverse wider gaps than conventional tracked vehicles could manage. The first prototype, Little Willie, completed testing in December 1915. It crossed a 5-foot trench but failed the vertical obstacle requirement. Wilson and Tritton redesigned the hull into a rhomboid shape, creating Big Willie, officially His Majesty's Landship Centipede, nicknamed Mother, in January 1916. The prototype specifications were radical: 31 feet long, 13 feet wide, 8 feet high, with tracks that could cross an 11-foot trench. Armor plating ranged from 6mm to 12mm thickness, sufficient to defeat German 7.92mm SMK ammunition at ranges beyond 100 yards. 2 British Army officers, Major Ernest Swinton of the Royal Engineers and Lieutenant Colonel Hugh Ells, observed trials on February 2, 1916, and filed enthusiastic reports recommending immediate production. The British War Office, initially skeptical, authorized production after the Somme offensive's July casualties demonstrated that conventional tactics offered no solution to defensive firepower. On February 12, 1916, the War Office ordered 100 tanks from William Foster and Company and Metropolitan Carriage, Wagon and Finance Company. The vehicles were designated tanks for security purposes. Workers were told they were manufacturing water carriers from Mesopotamia, and the name persisted. Production began immediately at Foster's Wellington Foundry in Lincoln and Metropolitan's factory in Birmingham. Each tank required 7 weeks to manufacture, employed 21 skilled workers, and cost £5,000, equivalent to 30 machine guns or 4 artillery pieces. The manufacturing challenge was formidable. Britain's industrial base specialized in naval construction and artillery production, not armored vehicle fabrication. Foster and Metropolitan had to develop new welding techniques, train workers in armor plate assembly, and establish supply chains for components that didn't exist in 1915. By September 1916, British industry had produced 49 operational tanks, not aircraft, which couldn't carry troops, not armored cars, which couldn't cross trenches, but mobile, armored, wire-crushing, trench-crossing weapon systems that conventional defensive doctrine had no answer for. German intelligence, dismissing the impossible. German military intelligence received reports of British landship development from multiple sources throughout mid-1916. The response was systematic dismissal. Hauptmann Walter Nicolai, chief of German military intelligence, Nachrichtenabteilung, filed an assessment on July 28, 1916, after interrogating British prisoners captured during the Somme offensive. Prisoners repeat consistent stories of large armored vehicles capable of crossing trenches. The technical specifications they describe: 11-foot trench crossing, armor-proof against standard rifle fire, exceed known engineering capabilities. Assessment: British propaganda designed to affect German morale. Reality: no such vehicle is practically feasible with current technology. The assessment was professionally competent and completely wrong. German engineers, consulting with automotive manufacturers in Stuttgart and Munich, confirmed that conventional tracked vehicles couldn't cross trenches wider than their wheelbase. The rhomboidal track configuration hadn't occurred to German designers, who assumed track length was limited by vehicle dimensions. British security was excellent. Photographs of tank trials remained classified, and the few civilians who witnessed tests near Hatfield Park in Hertfordshire were sworn to secrecy under the Defence of the Realm Act. German aerial reconnaissance photographed unusual structures near British supply depots in August 1916, but couldn't identify their purpose. Photographs taken on August 17th over Evrange showed large rectangular objects under camouflaged tarpaulins. German photo interpreters classified them as possible artillery positions or supply dumps. The possibility that they were revolutionary weapon systems never reached Falkenhayn's headquarters. By early September, German frontline units reported increasing British activity in the Flers-Courcelette sector. The 163rd Infantry Regiment received intelligence summaries warning of a major offensive but containing no mention of armored vehicles. German defensive preparations followed standard doctrine: reinforce machine gun positions, verify artillery ranging, ensure ammunition supplies for sustained defensive fire. The 163rd established 18 machine gun positions covering the approaches to Flers, confident that British infantry would face the same casualties that had characterized 3 months of Somme fighting. What they didn't prepare for, what they couldn't prepare for within conventional defensive doctrine, was protection that rendered machine gun fire irrelevant. The production campaign, industrial mobilization. While German intelligence dismissed Landship reports, British industry transformed prototype into weapon system. The production campaign revealed industrial capacity that would characterize the war's final 2 years. William Foster and Company, a pre-war agricultural machinery manufacturer employing 1,200 workers, converted its entire Lincoln factory to tank production in March 1916. By September, Foster employed 2,400 workers, including 847 women who replaced men conscripted into military service. The Wellington foundry operated 18-hour shifts, 7 days per week, producing components for 3 tanks weekly by August 1916. Metropolitan Carriage in Birmingham followed similar expansion. The factory employed 650 workers in February 1916, 1,800 by September. Women comprised 43% of Metropolitan's workforce by Flers-Courcelette, performing welding, assembly, and quality inspection, previously considered skilled male labor. Metropolitan's production rate, 2 tanks per week by late August. The industrial challenge extended beyond final assembly. Armor plate came from Sheffield Steel Mills, Vickers, Armstrong, Whitworth, and John Brown and Company, which had to develop rolling techniques for plates up to 12 mm thick while maintaining armor quality. Engine production required Daimler to modify their 105 horsepower sleeve valve petrol engines for armored vehicle installation. Track manufacturing involved new heat treatment processes developed by William Beardmore and Company in Glasgow. Cost analysis reveals the commitment. Each tank consumed steel equivalent to 8 field artillery pieces, required machining hours equivalent to 14 machine guns, and cost more than twice the annual salary of a British factory worker. British production by September 15th, 1916. 49 operational tanks representing £245,000 in direct manufacturing costs, plus £430,000 in factory conversion and tooling expenses. Total British investment in a technology German intelligence dismissed as propaganda. £675,000, equivalent to the cost of 135 heavy artillery pieces. The production comparison is revealing. German tank development wouldn't begin until after Flers-Courcelette, and Germany's first operational tank, the A7V, wouldn't reach production until October 1917, 13 months after British tanks proved their battlefield value. Britain's industrial commitment to an unproven technology, made during maximum artillery production demands, demonstrated willingness to innovate that German military conservatism couldn't match. Flers-Courcelette. The Landship Offensive. The Battle of Flers-Courcelette began at 6:20 a.m. on September 15, 1916, with preparatory bombardment from 1,000 British artillery pieces. Standard procedure for Somme offensives. What wasn't standard was the 32 tanks moving forward behind the barrage. The Mark I tank, deployed at Flers, came in two variants: male tanks mounting two 6-pounder naval guns and 3 machine guns, and female tanks mounting 5 machine guns. Each tank carried a crew of 8, commander, driver, 2 gearsmen. The Mark I lacked a conventional transmission. Steering required 2 men manually operating separate track clutches and 4 gunners. Internal conditions were brutal. Engine noise made communication impossible. Temperatures exceeded 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Carbon monoxide from the engine filled the crew compartment, and the armor spalled under bullet impact, sending metal fragments through the interior. The 32 tanks attacking at Flers divided into 3 groups supporting infantry assaults by the 41st Division, the New Zealand Division, and the Canadian Corps. The tank deployment wasn't a massed armored assault. Tanks operated in small groups, each assigned to support specific infantry battalions attacking designated objectives. British commanders, uncertain of tank reliability, treated them as supporting weapons, not as breakthrough exploitation forces. Tank C5, commanded by Captain H. W. Mortimer, attacked with the 41st Division at 6:20 a.m. Mortimer's tank crossed the British front trench, crushed 30 yards of German barbed wire entanglements, crossed the German front trench at 6:34 a.m., and continued toward the German second line. German machine gun fire from the 163rd Infantry Regiment's positions sparked harmlessly off C5's armor. British infantry of the 122nd Brigade followed 50 yards behind the tank, using it as mobile cover. By 7:15 a.m., C5 had reached Flers village's outskirts, crossed 3 German trench lines, and enabled the 122nd Brigade to advance 1,800 yards with fewer than 200 casualties, an advance rate and casualty ratio unprecedented in 3 months of Somme fighting. Tank D-17, commanded by 2nd Lieutenant Stuart Hasty of the Heavy Section Machine Gun Corps, attacked the German positions north of Flers at 6:25 a.m. Hasty's tank carried infantry liaison officer Captain Arthur Inglis of the Seaforth Highlanders, who observed German defensive response. Inglis's after-action report, filed September 16th, documented: German machine gun crews maintained fire discipline, concentrating fire on the tank's tracks and vision ports. Standard 7.92 mm ammunition proved ineffective. At approximately 6:55 a.m., observed German infantry abandoning prepared positions in obvious panic. Tank proceeded through Flers village at 7:20 a.m., with infantry following in line behind. By 9 a.m., tanks had achieved tactical results that conventional infantry assaults couldn't produce. The 41st Division advanced 2,500 yards in the Flers sector. The New Zealand Division, supported by 6 tanks, captured all objectives by 8:45 a.m. with 1,160 casualties, compared to 7,048 New Zealand casualties during the September 12th assault on Delville Wood 3 days earlier, which gained 400 yards. The Canadian Corps, supported by 8 tanks attacking Courcelette, captured the village by 10:30 a.m. Tank effectiveness varied dramatically. Of 49 tanks allocated to the battle, 17 broke down before reaching German lines. Mechanical reliability remained the Mark I's critical weakness. Engines overheated, tracks through, transmissions failed. The remaining 32 tanks that reached German positions transformed infantry assault mathematics. Infantry, following tanks, advanced at rates between 100 and 150 yards per hour, slow by cavalry standards, revolutionary for Somme battlefield conditions, where previous advances measured 20 yards per hour at catastrophic casualties. German defensive response revealed doctrinal paralysis. Machine gun crews maintained fire discipline, expending ammunition against targets their weapons couldn't damage. Artillery crews, trained to fire at mapped coordinates rather than moving targets, struggled to engage tanks effectively. The 163rd Infantry Regiment's War Diary, filed September 15th, recorded, British armored vehicles crossed all defensive positions. Standard defensive fire proved ineffective. Infantry abandoned positions in several sectors. Casualties moderate, despite position loss due to inability to maintain defensive fire. The Battle of Flers-Courcelette continued through September 22nd, but the tank's debut established its battlefield role. British forces advanced 2 miles on a 6-mile front, modest by pre-war offensive standards, revolutionary for the Somme, where previous offensives measured success in hundreds of yards. More significantly, British casualties for the week totaled 29,000, compared to 57,470 on the Somme's first day, July 1st, when conventional infantry assault produced 5 times the casualties for 1/10 the territorial gain. German response: tactical confusion and adaptation. German military response to the tank proceeded through stages of denial, improvisation, and systematic counter-development. Immediate reaction at division and corps level was dismissive. The 163rd Infantry Regiment's after-action report, filed September 17th, described tanks as curiosities that achieved surprise but posed no sustained threat to prepared defensive positions. Corps Headquarters assessment, dated September 19th, concluded, British armored vehicles demonstrated limited tactical value, mechanical unreliability, slow speed, and vulnerability to artillery fire restrict operational employment. No doctrinal revision necessary. This assessment was professionally competent and strategically wrong. It focused on the Mark I's obvious limitations: 32 tanks deployed, 17 mechanical failures, slow speed of 3.7 miles per hour maximum, while missing the revolutionary implication. For the first time, infantry could assault defended positions with protection against machine gun fire. By late September, German defensive doctrine began acknowledging the threat. OHL, Oberste Heeresleitung, German Supreme Command, issued tactical guidance on September 28th. British armored vehicles vulnerable to direct artillery fire. Anti-tank defense requires forward-deployed field artillery with direct fire capability. This guidance was theoretically sound and practically difficult to implement. German artillery doctrine emphasized indirect fire from concealed positions, retraining artillery crews for direct anti-tank engagement, establishing forward artillery positions vulnerable to British counter-battery fire, and developing armor-piercing ammunition required resources Germany struggled to allocate during simultaneous Eastern Front operations and Verdun defense. The doctrinal problem was fundamental. German defensive system depended on depth, multiple trench lines, deep dugouts, layered machine gun positions. Tanks negated depth by crossing successive trench lines. The machine gun, the weapon that made German defensive doctrine viable, proved ineffective against armored targets. Artillery could destroy tanks but required direct observation and armor-piercing ammunition that didn't exist in German stockpiles. German countermeasures evolved slowly. The K-bullet, Kurzpatron, Patron SMK, armor-piercing round for standard Gewehr 98 rifles, entered production in October 1916. It could penetrate 12mm armor at ranges under 100 yards, theoretically effective against British tanks. Production numbers reveal German industrial response. German ammunition factories produced 3 million K-bullets by December 1916, distributed at rates of 3 bullets per rifleman. Compare this to British tank production: 150 tanks operational by December 1916. German investment in rifle bullets to counter 150 enemy tanks demonstrated industrial inefficiency that would characterize later German responses to Allied technological innovations. Anti-tank artillery development proceeded even more slowly. German ordnance designers developed the Tankgewehr M 1918, a 13.2mm anti-tank rifle, but it didn't reach frontline distribution until spring 1918, 18 months after Flers-Courcelette. Specialized anti-tank field guns, the 3.7cm TAK, entered service in limited numbers during 1918. Germany's doctrinal response to tanks lagged British tank development by 12 to 18 months throughout the war's final 2 years. More revealing was German tank development. OHL authorized German tank design in October 1916. The resulting A7V, Germany's only operational tank design during the war, entered service in October 1917, 13 months after Flers-Courcelette. German industry produced 20 A7Vs by armistice. compared to British production of 2,636 tanks between September 1916 and November 1918. The production ratio, 132 to 1 in Britain's favor, revealed not just industrial capacity differences but doctrinal conservatism that delayed German commitment to armored warfare. The fundamental issue was recognition. German military leadership, trained in pre-war Kriegsakademie doctrine emphasizing defensive superiority and firepower mathematics, struggled to accept that industrial innovation had rendered significant portions of their doctrine obsolete. Each adaptation, K-bullets, anti-tank rifles, A7V development, came after British tanks demonstrated capability, never in anticipation of emerging threats. The recognition obsolescence, acknowledged. German recognition of the tank's significance evolved through tactical reports, strategic assessments, and post-war analysis. Crown Prince Ruprecht of Bavaria, commanding the 6th Army Group during Flers Courcelette, filed an assessment on October 3, 1916. British armored vehicles represent significant tactical innovation. Current defensive doctrine provides inadequate countermeasures. Recommend immediate development of specialized anti-tank weapons and German armored vehicle program. This assessment, filed 18 days after the battle, represented the earliest German admission that tanks required doctrinal revision. General Erich Ludendorff, who replaced Falkenhayn as chief of the German General Staff on August 29, 1916, addressed tank implications in his November 1916 strategic memorandum. The enemy's employment of armored vehicles at Flers demonstrated capability to breach defensive positions previously considered impregnable. The defensive superiority that characterized 1915 to 1916 operations no longer provides absolute security. German forces must develop both counter-tank measures and equivalent armored capability. The recognition was clear. Defensive firepower doctrine, which sustained German strategy for 2 years, couldn't stop tanks. The industrial solution Britain found, mobile armor protecting infantry during assault, changed Western Front tactical mathematics. Pre-war calculations assumed attacking infantry would remain vulnerable to defensive fire. That assumption died at Flers Courcelette. Later, British tank employment reinforced the recognition. The Battle of Cambrai, November 20th, 1917, saw 476 British tanks achieve breakthrough on a 6-mile front, advancing 5 miles in 12 hours, the deepest British penetration since 1914. German defensive positions that should have stopped infantry assaults for weeks fell in hours. Only mechanical breakdown and lack of reserves to exploit success prevented strategic breakthrough. Post-war assessments were unequivocal. Major General J.F.C. Fuller, who commanded the Royal Tank Corps during the war's final year, wrote in his 1923 analysis, "The tank restored tactical mobility to the battlefield. It solved the problem that dominated 1914 to 1916. How to protect infantry from defensive firepower during assault." The solution wasn't superior tactics or better training, but industrial innovation that rendered defensive calculations obsolete. German post-war studies acknowledged Fuller's assessment. General Hermann von Kuhl's 1929 operational history admitted, "The tank's appearance at Flers represented technological breakthrough. German defensive doctrine couldn't counter. Our response, developing anti-tank weapons and our own armored vehicles, came too slowly to affect strategic outcomes." By 1918, Allied armored superiority contributed significantly to Germany's battlefield defeats. The irony was complete. German intelligence dismissed British Landship reports as propaganda in July 1916. By November 1918, British and French tanks numbered over 6,000, while German industry had produced 20 A7Vs and captured approximately 170 Allied tanks for German use. The defensive superiority that sustained German strategy for 2 years proved temporary. Industrial innovation, British willingness to invest in unproven technology, develop new manufacturing processes, and commit resources to revolutionary weapon systems, overcame defensive mathematics that should have made breakthrough impossible. The Industrial War's verdict. The tank's success at Flers Courcelette wasn't about superior German intelligence versus British innovation. It was about industrial capacity, meeting tactical problems with engineering solutions. Pre-war military doctrine, German and Allied alike, assumed infantry would remain vulnerable to defensive fire, and breakthrough would require overwhelming numerical superiority or defender exhaustion. The Western Front through mid-1916 validated these assumptions. Every offensive produced casualties disproportionate to territorial gain, defensive firepower dominated tactical calculations, and stalemate seemed permanent. British tank development represented different thinking. Industrial problems require industrial solutions. If defensive firepower stops infantry, protect infantry with armor. If trenches stop vehicles, design vehicles that cross trenches. If conventional warfare produces stalemate, develop unconventional weapons. The approach wasn't uniquely British. France developed its own tank programs, the Schneider CA-1 and Saint-Chamond, which entered service in spring 1917. But Britain committed industrial resources earliest and most systematically. The production numbers tell the story. British tank production, 2,636 between September 1916 and November 1918. French tank production, 3,870 during the same period. German tank production, 20. Allied willingness to invest in unproven technology, accept high development costs, and mobilize industrial capacity for revolutionary weapon systems, contrasted with German conservatism that delayed tank development for over a year after Flers-Courcelette proved the concept. German defensive doctrine wasn't wrong in 1914. It was incomplete. It calculated infantry vulnerability accurately, but couldn't anticipate industrial solutions to tactical problems. The machine gun, the weapon that made defensive doctrine viable, met its counter in mobile armor that rendered defensive firepower temporarily obsolete. German tactical excellence couldn't overcome industrial innovation that changed warfare's fundamental mathematics. Lieutenant Wilhelm Wartig, who observed the first tank attack at Flers on September 15, 1916, survived the war and published his memoirs in 1924. His reflection on that morning captured the transition. We understood defensive warfare. We knew machine guns stopped infantry, barbed wire delayed assaults, and artillery suppressed attacks. What we couldn't understand, what no amount of tactical training prepared us for, was a weapon that ignored our calculations. The British didn't defeat our defensive doctrine with better infantry or more artillery. They defeated it with industrial innovation that made our expertise obsolete. We were professionals fighting a 19th century war. They were industrialists solving 20th century problems. The difference determined the war's outcome. The tank at Flers-Courcelette represented more than tactical success. It demonstrated industrial warfare's character. Problems military doctrine couldn't solve yielded to engineering innovation. Production capacity mattered more than tactical excellence, and the nation that mobilized industry most effectively would ultimately prevail. German intelligence dismissed British landships as propaganda because professional military thinking couldn't imagine civilians, engineers, manufacturers, welders, solving problems that professional soldiers considered insoluble. The dismissal cost Germany 18 months of technological inferiority and contributed to strategic defeat. The devil came to Flers-Courcelette on September 15th, 1916. German soldiers called it a monster. British soldiers called it a tank. But it was simply industrial innovation meeting tactical stalemate. The breakthrough it enabled wasn't decisive. Mechanical reliability limited tanks' strategic impact until 1918. But the concept it proved, that industrial solutions could overcome defensive doctrine, shaped warfare for the next century. The professional soldiers of 1914, German and British alike, went to war believing military training and tactical doctrine determined outcomes. The factories of Lincoln and Birmingham proved them wrong.